Hello. In this video, we're going to look at some definitions. First, we're going to look at the fundamental identity of trigonometry. If alpha is any angle or real number, then sine squared alpha plus cosine squared alpha equals 1. Now, I'm going to go ahead and prove that real quick. We know that if xy is any point on the coordinate grid and alpha is an angle that is using the central angle or the is in standard position, then there we go, some xy there. Whoa, there we go. There's a radius there, alpha. So r is the square root of x squared plus y squared. Now, we know that we've defined sine and cosine as something. We've defined sine alpha as y over r, and we've defined cosine alpha as x over r. Now notice something. I'm going to start out with sine squared alpha plus cosine squared alpha. And we want to go ahead and prove this identity. So what we mean by proving an identity is begin with one side of the identity and make it look like the other. So to do that, sine squared alpha plus cosine squared alpha, what this means with a square right here is that this entire sine alpha is being squared. And we do that so that we don't make it confused, or we don't confuse it with sine of alpha squared. So if you didn't have that, if you did sine of alpha squared, you would assume that that would be like this, not like that. So what we would like to do is sine squared alpha, and the same thing with cosine squared alpha, and so on and so forth. So we're going to replace the sine squared alpha with y over r squared. And the same thing with the cosine squared alpha. And cosine squared alpha would be the, come on now, x over r squared. Good. Now, here's the thing. Square everything in here. That gives me y squared over r squared plus x squared over r squared. And r is the square root of the sum of the squares. So r squared would just be the sum of the squares. It's the Pythagorean theorem, basically. So this would give me, now notice that we have r squared in the denominator, so it gives me y squared plus x squared all over r squared. And then x squared plus y squared is just r squared, so it gives me r squared over r squared, which simplifies to 1. QED. Or, as some people like to do, a square that's been filled in. I'm not a big fan of the square one. I prefer QED. Now, we just proved the fundamental identity of trigonometry. Sine squared alpha plus cosine squared alpha equals 1. I'll say it usually with sine squared plus cosine squared equals 1. But it means sine squared alpha plus cosine squared alpha equals 1. The fact that this is called a fundamental identity should be a clue to you that you're going to need to know this for sure, with no difficulty whatsoever. Now, it's called fundamental, which means that it's actually very foundational for what we're going to do in much of the rest of the chapters. So make sure that we learn this. As for the reference angle, if theta is a non-quadrantal angle in standard position, then the reference angle for theta is the positive acute angle theta prime, red theta prime, formed by the terminal side of theta and the positive or negative x-axis. Now what this means is when you're working with an angle, and if it's some angle that's not between 0 and 90, if that's theta, then the theta prime is going to be the one that brings it to the x-axis that's between 0 and 90. So this would be theta prime. Now, theta prime is always between 0 and 90. It's an absolute magnitude. Same thing with this. If it was, say, right here, that angle there, this would be theta. Therefore, theta prime would be there. Okay, kind of see how that works. Whichever one goes closest to the x-axis in either the left direction or the right direction. Alrighty. Now the reason that we do the reference angle is because the reference angle is actually very important. It allows us to use the fact that sine, cosine, tangent, and cosecant, secant, cotangent are all basically the same thing. If you know the first quadrant, you know everything else. And the reason why is because you literally just need to know the first quadrant. Because of this saying, all students take calculus. A stands for all, S stands for sine, T for tangent, C for cosine. In other words, this is telling me in what quadrant are the trigonometric functions positive. So in the first quadrant, all of them are positive. In the second quadrant, sine is positive. In the third quadrant, tangent is positive. And in the fourth quadrant, cosine is positive. So with that, you'll be able to figure out what the rest of them are. Alrighty. Well, I think I'm going to go ahead and end the video here. And I will see you in the next one. Have fun.